Hello, everybody. As you can see on the screen, we have the quote, "Truth is different for different people." I posted this on Sakai on the page and had you write a comment on your thoughts on this. And again, in the true nature of this class, there is no right or wrong response for this, which then could indicate that maybe this quote is something that you agree with if you believe that since everyone's answer is going to be different, truth then is different for different people. So again, going back to that mind, messing with your mind about everything. So this quote is introducing the topic of relativism versus absolutism, which are two different concepts in the ethic discussion. We'll kind of break it down. These conversations do come up in some of the Bible and theology classes because it is part of religious discussions and what that looks like in the context of Christianity. So these terms might be something that's familiar to you, but they're going to be looked at in this lecture kind of through the lens of social work and how we make our decisions and how we personally come to think about different things. Excuse me. So here we go. So if you felt like you aligned more agreeing or we'll start with disagreeing. If you disagree with the statement, truth is different for different people, your ethical perspective does align more with absolutism. If you agree with the statement and you believe it to be true, you align with more of the relativism perspective. I do find in ethical discussions, a lot of this terminology has multi-syllable words, and sometimes they're very hard to say. So bear with me when I stumble over saying them very eloquently. So, all right, we have absolutism and relativism, which we're going to break down now. So the first one, ethical absolutism. So this philosophy and perspective holds that moral commands are true at all times. It's a very black and white, specific, objective perspective. It means that the ethical standards and beliefs are true in all cultures and situations, regardless of circumstances or the results. So if we're going back to the ethical theories that we discussed on Monday and learned about last week, this aligns very well with deontology. And so the action is what's right or wrong, not the outcome or situation. Very black and white, very concrete, very objective. So an example of an absolutism perspective is that actions such as murder and stealing are seen as objectively wrong regardless of the motivation or outcome. And so if you think about, I know there's been some news stories within the recent years around human trafficking, and a girl who was trafficked murdered her traffickers as a way to escape, and she ended up getting convicted of the murders. So under the absolutism viewpoint, that would be very acceptable and the right conviction because murder is murder regardless of what happened. She chose to take a life even though it resulted in her freedom and the murder of people who had done a crime against her. She still had murdered somebody, and so that conviction was correct. Now, when we talk about relativism, you can see that's kind of the opposite, but that is the viewpoint that aligns with absolutism. So, because it's easy to say, well, that's messed up, or that absolutism is incorrect, or have our preconceived notions about it based on how we perceive the world. I do want to look at the advantages and disadvantages of both of these viewpoints because there's value to both, and there's also some caution to both. So advantages of absolutism is it does allow moral rules to be evaluated critically because you're setting a standard. You're not basing it off someone's emotions or past or their perceptions or biases. It is making that level playing field for everybody, that you have no question that something is right or wrong based on absolutism. There's no gray within this. And so it does provide some moral rules and some fairness in society. And so if you're thinking of like the court system, you have rules and convictions in different sentencing based on X, Y, or Z. So it does provide a platform to weigh and base decisions. It is fair as people are treated the same, as the rules are the same for everybody. And so it does kind of take off potential biases of people based on race, age, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. Everyone is treated the same and held to the same standards regardless of the situation, their background, or what they're bringing to the table. And if a moral rule is right or wrong, there would be no need to have different rules for different people because the absolute rules are universal. And so, again, it's going back to saying everybody is treated fairly and the same. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. And it really then ideally would eliminate some of the racial tensions that come around. There's been so many stories, unfortunate, horrible stories in the news where there's evidence to show there's discrimination against people based on their race, and different treatment about the people who've been convicted based on their race. And so if there was ethical absolutism across the board, those conversations wouldn't be in play. And so we're going to put a reflection question into the Sakai. So thinking about ethical absolutism, I want you guys to be able to think about, are there situations where the ethical absolutism viewpoint would be beneficial? So look forward to that after you watch the video. Now, there are some disadvantages to this. I think right off the bat, does absolutism actually exist? Is the human race capable of universally adopting and adhering to an absolute criteria for things? There's so much diversity in the world that it's really hard to say. We're going to talk about how culture impacts some of this, how religion impacts some of it, since there's diversity in culture and religion, is it even possible for a universal absolute to exist? So I think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the United Nations created. That's an attempt to have an absolutism about what human rights exist for each individual. But we can see if you've taken international social worker, just have kind of a brain in general, we see human rights violations all the time. So we can see that people do not adhere to an absolute even at the attempts to put one in place. Sometimes it's not appropriate to treat people the same due to circumstances that arise due to situations. So going back to that situation where the individual who'd been trafficked murdered her traffickers, that's a very different situation than somebody breaking into a house and murdering somebody so they could steal their possessions without somebody stopping them. So sometimes it is beneficial to look at the situations because circumstances and motivations aren't always the same. Life really is not black and white. And if this was the case, it is simply not right to make everybody live by the same rules. Humans are diverse. We're not robots. And so the world is not black and white. We can thank the fall for that one, primarily because they introduced sin and brokenness into the world. But as a consequence, it is virtually impossible to make everybody live by the same rules because there's so much diversity in thought, situation, and equality that it just would not be beneficial. So the next question you pose then is, when is ethical absolutism possibly harmful? I'm going to have you answer that on the Sakai page as well. Can't use the responses that I've shared in the video. I want you to think of different ones because there's many opportunities that I did not share where it is beneficial and also harmful. So that's ethical absolutism. I'm going to go back to recap. It aligns very well with deontology, kind of focusing more on the black and white, right and wrong, not a lot of gray. Well, actually, there is no gray area. And adhering to a set standard for everybody regardless of situation or outcome. So again, looking at the right or wrong, black and white. Absolutism. All right, ethical relativism. So this position views that all points are equally valid And the individual determines for themselves what is true and what's relative for them. So there's a lot of self-determination. If you're going to mirror it to a social work ethical standard, self-determination is very relative and aligns very clearly with ethical relativism. It theorizes that the truth is different for different people, not simply that different people believe different things to be true. It's kind of that everyone has their own value system created differently, and then they adhere to their value system, and that becomes their truth independent of what anybody else thinks. So if you think back to absolutism, people might believe different things to be true, but when it comes down to it, there's still one universal truth. Relativism identifies that everyone's truth is valid and equally true in the context of the person. So it's a slight nuance, but that's kind of what that means. So because we live in the culture of memes and cartoons, here's a nice little courtroom where the lawyer's saying that his client pleads not guilty by reason of cultural relativism because they believe themselves to be in the right, and so they're not guilty. So, haha, funny. All right. Relativism is a little bit more involved than absolutism, which probably shouldn't be a surprise because absolutism is very black and white. There's not much talking you can do about it. But relativism does have various nuances attached to it. So here are different types and different aspects to relativism. The first one is subjective ethical relativism. And pieces of subjective ethical relativism is that it supports the view that truth of moral principles is relative to an individual. So my truth is true to me, your truth is true to you, and they're both equally true because we believe them to be true. And they are going to dictate what we deem as moral and ethical and motivate our actions. Whatever you believe is right for you personally, it's completely up to you to determine. So I know we were talking about Alcoholics Anonymous on the class on Monday, and how a piece of AA is that you have to believe in a higher power. That's like a piece. You have to identify what your higher power is, but you can see relativism kind of coming into that because each individual is left to determine what their higher power is. And so it can be anything from having like the Christian God as their higher power, something from Islam, or having Buddha or Allah. A trash can be a higher power. It's very subjective and it's up to the individual to determine. So that's kind of how, like a very concrete example of what relativism is. People get to make up what their own truth, whether it makes sense to somebody else or not. It is true to them and it's what drives them. And it allows you to be the sovereign over the principles that dictate how you live your life. Now, here's the danger with this, is that it could promote anarchy if I believe that because I live on the earth and pay taxes, I'm part of society, that I have the right to everybody's property because I'm paying taxes to the city. So if I want to come into your house when I can, my right, I paid for taxes for property. That might be very different than somebody who believes I bought the house, so this is my private property. You can't come in here, and that might conflict because we're each determining something to be true and sovereign for ourselves. It kind of puts us at the God figure, for lack of a better term, because we are the ultimate determinant of what is right and wrong. Now, there's also what is called cultural relativism. And so that is looking at cultures being the determinant of what is right or wrong. And so if you are a full Kuiper student, you have taken intercultural communications, you talked a lot about cultures and what that looks like. I'm guessing there's probably a similar class at Davenport, but it's something that I'm hoping at this point in your education, you're very aware that there's a lot of diversity and that cultures are not all one and the same. But essentially, similar to the other one, culture is what says it's right, was really right for you versus you yourself. So you're adhering to whatever culture says, and then culture becomes the society. culture or society becomes the higher authority, essentially the God figure about what is determining what's right and wrong for individual. So subjective is more individualized. Culture adheres to